So I'm here in the Japanese village in Ayutthaya, Thailand, and it's fascinating. I just saw a video. So what's really interesting about this particular place is that around a certain point in time, the Japanese and Japan became antagonistic towards Catholics. And so at a certain point in time, of the 1,000 or so Japanese that were here, over a majority of them were Catholics. And they had fled Japan to come over here because of discrimination in Japan. And what's really interesting here is that you've got in Ayutthaya, you have obviously a very open society because the king was able to invite the Persians, the Arabs. I forgot the name that they gave them. Actually, what's interesting, I think it's Chaek. What's really interesting is that they actually called the Portuguese Chaek also, right? It gives you an idea of the Moors and the Persians and so on, but also the Dutch, the French. And one of the things that they talk about here in this museum is that the Dutch were respected because they stayed out of religion. In other words, they confined themselves to trading rather than interfering with domestic affairs. It also gave the Dutch an advantage because, when the tables turned, when you had a situation where a new military would invade, it always happens to anywhere that's prosperous. Somebody wants to invade and take what that institution or that culture or that society has built. It's very easy to pack up and go. So the Dutch do seem to have that history. And they did the same thing in Indonesia. When they had a financial collapse in Indonesia, the Dutch took off as well, very conveniently. So it also gives the trader or foreigner an advantage by not interfering in domestic affairs. It allows them to leave. So whether that's a good thing or a bad thing in the long run, is for history to decide. So one of the other epiphanies I had while coming here is that for probably thousands of years, you've had a conflict between institutions attempting to take over power. And what's happening now with the militaries all over the world, they're aligning. It's not just NATO, they're all aligning. And that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to cut military spending. I don't care where you are, in this world today, in the 21st century, you are going to be in a country that has increased military spending. And the reason for that is obviously not only a greater alliance, but also this idea that you don't have to invade anymore. You just have to align your militaries and get them on the same technological standard. And then at that point, you're essentially safe from each other's institutions. So obviously that has crowded out the space for civilian institutions. And so the farther back you go, you realize that you're in a position where, you've had competitions between royalty, kings, princes, essentially diplomatic foundations that have a lot of money behind them to get things done. You've got religion, right? And then you've got the military, and then you have the corporations, British East India Company, Dutch East India Company, and so on and so forth. And you've got the multinational corporations. And then below all them, right, you've got these little small businesses and individuals struggling to survive. The farmers, the people that make things, and so on and so forth. And probably today in the West, you have the unions as well, although they're also tied to financial institutions, which are also tied to the military, because they have to get funded. So, what you notice over the last, since World War II, is that militaries all over the world are crowding out space for civilian institutions. What is more problematic in the West is that, at least since Vietnam, you have the Catholic Church aligning itself with the military. So you've actually taken one of the most powerful religions in the world and aligned itself, put its power in the same column as worldwide militaries. So that actually removes something. Now, by the way, the Japanese societies are different now, obviously, than the West, in part because they did, oppose the Catholic Church expanding within Japan. And so that's one of the reasons why things are different in Japan. So once you have that much money and that much power coming in, what ends up happening is you have a lot of homogenous alignment, right? They bring whatever worked for them in their country into your country, even if it's not, cookie cutter, copy and paste. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Obviously, in the United States, it worked in Germany, in part because a lot of Germans, right? So you have a lot of these issues coming in. You have a lot of, a lot of lessons to be learned in terms of this battle for influence, and also whether or not the more open a society is, whether or not it's easier to invade. And I think the answer is yes. So the real battle between civilian and military institutions is not only diversity, is not only openness, right? It's also how you balance the conflicts between these institutions in a way that promotes civilian institutions, right? Or civilian thought, civilian intellectualism. Because if you don't do that, then you get conquered by someone else who hasn't prioritized it, right? Who's imbalanced, but in a way that allows an advantage in one thing, destruction. And one of the reasons that Ayutthaya is an interesting place, or perhaps, is not only because it was able to bring everyone all over the world together, but it's also a tragic place, right? Because a lot of what you see is new here. This is obviously new. It was all built over the last 200 or so years because the Burmese, which I assume had an empire as well, invaded. In other words, they saw a prosperous, diverse place and they destroyed it. And I just realized, by the way, you go all over Southeast Asia, you see the Buddha heads, in the trunks at the very bottom in the soil of these magnificent trees. Well, I realized coming over here, right, most of the statues do not have Buddha heads. I realized that the invaders most likely cut off the heads and had to hide them somewhere, and they probably hid them in the forest where they thought nobody would come in, and then probably they had to leave at some point. Maybe there was a counter invasion, and that's why the trees were able to grow, and suddenly there's a Buddha head down there as the foliage is cleared away. I'm not a history expert, but I'm just making this assumption, right? You got to hide something somewhere when you invade and then go back. You still have trade going back and forth. So the whole point of all this, right, is how you establish equilibrium and balance between these powerful institutions, particularly now that you've gone from, say, 1,000 people in this village, right, to perhaps thousands of dollars or whatnot of trade into millions of people and trillions of dollars of vested interests. What do you do? How do you take over? How do you counterbalance? How do you have equilibrium when the numbers are so big? And that's something that the civilian institutions, the academics, have yet to figure out. And we know that because debt has exploded all over the world. This whole imbalance is being propped up by massive debt, which is in part also aided by the alliances between the militaries all over the world, which don't mind debt going up as long as they maintain their power. So whether civilian institutions and the academics and the intellectuals and the artists, all of whom operate under the assumption of a somewhat fair and balanced system that allows freedom of expression in a way that promotes progress, but also looks backwards in order to draw a common line or common lines between societies and humanity in order to create these ropes that bind us together, in commonalities that are essentially tied back to human nature, which are supposed to bring about a greater chance of peace because of the greater manifestation of similarities between us rather than differences. And yet, that's the greatest interesting part about empires, right? They've got the ability to see these similarities between different groups because they attract economically a lot of diversity. But you still have to have the writers, the artists, to be able to draw lines between them that bind them together rather than tear them apart. The military is almost never the right one in terms of being able to draw those lines, especially now where you have trillions of dollars being used and in part being promoted or gathered based on fear, which requires differences to be exaggerated as opposed to similarities. So that's the state of the world today.